It's good to have such a good number, and I want to thank particularly Rajani Naidoo, the network convener for this event, and our speakers for giving up their time for this event today. We are delivering most of our events online now, as you well know. So please keep an eye on the website for future events. We will be developing a good full program for September to December as well. There are not going to be any face-to-face events for the foreseeable future. So most of our events will be online. There are 286 guests today and 59 members. So my particular welcome to the guests. And what I'd ask the guests to do is to please consider taking up SRHE benefits. You know, we rely on your support to keep these going. There are lots of other benefits that are available to you. If you want to have a look, I'll put a copy now in the chat room where you can find our membership benefits. Also, for all our upcoming events, here is the link to upcoming events in the next few weeks. Please feel free to sign in for those as well. Our Twitter feed for today is at SRHE73. So, you know, we're going to have lots of comments, but let's continue the conversation today beyond the event itself. Use the Twitter feed. We have a blog, you know, and anyone who wants to contribute to this event via the blog, here's the blog link. Please have a look at it. We usually have 750 words contributions to that, which goes through our editor before we put it up online. So those are ways of staying involved. I'll be back again at the end of today with a link to the feedback form. We take all your comments seriously. So please do spend time doing that. And in the meanwhile now, I'll hand over to the chair of the today, Rajani, and to introduce the speakers. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Francois. And I think as Francois mentioned, it might be more comfortable for you to have the speaker view on, especially when our speakers talk, as Feluca will have PowerPoints as well. And the speaker view is right on the right-hand side of your screen. You have gallery view or speaker view. So I'd like to add my welcome to Francois. It's really very nice to see so many familiar faces, but also so many new faces. And I want to start by thanking Helen, Francois, Rob, and the rest of the SRHE team very, very much for all that they have done to make this possible. I'd like to thank our colleagues in the International Center for Higher Education Management, our colleagues in the Chair in Critical Studies in Higher Education Transformation at Nelson Mandela University for co-hosting this with us, but especially the co-convener of the SRHE Southwest Network, Dr. Lisa Lucas from the University of Bristol. So we've all seen how recent events have made very visible the escalation of murder, of violence, and discrimination arising from the very deep-seated and institutionalized racism in our societies. We've also seen hope. Hope has risen in the form of movements such as Black Lives Matter, and Black Lives Matter has gained global momentum and intersectional solidarity. So in this seminar, we focus on the role that higher education can play. How can we avoid perpetuating racism? What are the possibilities of decolonizing and transforming higher education? Do decolonization and transforming always go hand in hand? In other words, what are the ways in which universities can contribute to racial justice? We are really very, very privileged to have two inspirational speakers with us today. Each of our speakers will speak for 20 minutes. At the end of each presentation, I will ask for 2 questions from the chat room. At the end of the 2 presentations, we will have a general discussion. So colleagues, we have more than 350 participants online. So please, may I ask everyone to use the chat function rather than the video. So it's now such a great privilege to introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Foluke Adebisi from the University of Bristol. Foluke's scholarship actually links together equality, inequality, exclusion and exclusion in legal education. And she links this up with the idea of what is it to be human. She links this up with global inequality, and she links this up with environmental degradation. Foluke co-designed one of the first law and race units in the UK, and she convened the very first Decolonisation and the Law Conference at the University of Bristol. In 2018, Foluke was included in the Bristol Black and Minority Ethnic Groups Power List, which is a list of Bristol's 100 most inspiring people from BAM backgrounds. Foluke is also the founder of the Forever Africa Conference and events. Foluke, it's a great privilege to have you with us, and over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I should give a slight, thank you for that welcome and introduction. I should give a slight caveat. I'm at home with a child, so I'm just gonna have, it's probably gonna be slightly noisy while I shoo him away again. Sorry about that. Just had to have him close the door. Okay, thank you for that welcome. I'm going to be using a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, it's the wrong one. So today I want to talk about decolonization in the neoliberal university. So one of the premises of my talk is that universities are thinking about decolonization, but what should they do? So I'm not actually making the case for decolonization. As Rajani has mentioned, because of things that have already happened, lots of institutions, including universities, are thinking about, you know, how they can decolonize, how they can respond to movements like Black Lives Matter. So my suggestion is that if you're thinking about decolonizing the neoliberal university, or the premise of my talk is, if you're thinking about decolonizing the neoliberal university, what are the things you should initially be thinking about? But to start off, especially because I'm speaking from the context of UK higher education, but also understanding that UK higher education occupies a particular space within the global imagination. To start off, I'm going to try and very briefly define decolonization. I think it's important and quite vital to understand that decolonization is something which is way beyond EDI, so equality, diversity, inclusion, representation. So it's way beyond that. It's not just about, you know, messing around with reading lists, or as with law, changing a few names on the problem scenarios that we have. But we should also understand that decolonization itself has, you know, there are various schools. So for example, the Latin American Critical School talks about decentering, talks about inequality of knowledges, worlds otherwise, so different types of ways of being, living, and thinking. People who, scholars who write about decolonization from a settler colony perspective, they usually talk in terms of sort of giving back land. So almost, so Tuck and Young, for example, Linda Tui Smith talk about the reversal of the fruits of colonization. And in the case of post-colonial places, so post-colonial states, often talk about a disruption, because even though there was a political end to colonization, we're still left with the epistemological and economic structures or mechanisms of colonization. So that's sort of my brief definition of decolonization, slightly varied. So this seminar, I've been asked to talk about, what is the university's role in racial justice? And I think one of the problems, we have, and not just universities, one of the problems we have in addressing this is actually understanding, when we talk about racial justice, what does race mean here? Especially in these particular times where you've got COVID and there's a disproportionate, statistics have already shown, a disproportionate impact of COVID based on race. Now, it should be always at the forefront of our minds that race as biology, or race as something that has biological meaning, has been largely dismissed. And race as ethnicity, which is very much used in the UK, in itself is slightly problematic, because ethnicity is very cultural, and therefore replaces the sort of, a person's culture may change in a lifetime, but their skin color will not change. It should be always understood when we talk about racial justice that we're talking about things that have been socially constructed, which have a history. And there's a relationship between race and racism, which suggests that racism precedes race, rather than race preceding racism. So race has been constructed to create inequalities. And that's kind of the premise of what I'm trying to suggest universities have to think about. If inequalities have been created, we cannot use a deficit model to disrupt those inequalities. We have to think differently about that. So to think about what, on the one hand, we're thinking about what should the role of universities be in racial justice. I think we have to, before we think about that, we need to consider what the role of universities are also in racial injustice. And there's a whole 3-5 hour lecture I can give on the meanings of justice and injustice, but we will not go into that. But in the case of the particular areas that I think we need to consider when we're thinking about racial injustice. So there are a couple of ways that universities have been entangled in racial injustice. So academic justification, race science, racism, benefiting from colonialism, either directly or indirectly, and trading enslaved Africans, institutional racism, and racial capitalism. Now, the first two which I mentioned, they're more obvious, and they're, I would say, perhaps easier to address. And then in the last few months, weeks, we've seen a lot of, these being addressed by changing of names, changing of logos, removing of statues. But I think the last two, institutional racism and racial capitalism, are more woven into the structure of universities, and therefore they are harder to address, but I would say more important to address in trying to achieve racial justice. So understanding where universities stand or the roles they have played. And like I said, I'm really talking, about the context of the UK. And if you look at the stats I have on this PowerPoint, you look at the stats, you have almost what you would call a systematic disparity across the board. So, from things like pay gap, what we call the student attainment gap, which I prefer to call the student awarding gap, the disparity of UK professors by what we call ethnic group. The broken pipeline, I think, is very important to note. So over a 3-year period, that's 2016 to 2019, just 1.2% of the almost 20,000 studentships awarded by research councils in the UK went to Black or Black students. And only 30 of those were from a Black Caribbean background. So out of nearly 20,000 studentships awarded by UCRI, only 30 went to students with an African Caribbean background. So there is, I would say, a pattern of improvement. So the suggestion that universities can now sort of tag on an anterior role for equality in an atmosphere microcosm of inequality, I would say, is quite difficult. So, which is why I would suggest that the best way to think about decolonization is or one of the best ways to think about decolonization is by understanding institutional racism. So I have about 4 definitions of institutional racism, but what joins these definitions together is the idea that you have an almost automatic or programmed reproduction of sector-wide inequality in any particular sector. So it could be, as the McPherson report was a report on institutional racism within police. But think about a sector and then look at the stats that I showed in the last slide. An almost automatic programmed reproduction of sector-wide inequality. So essentially, it's trying to preserve the status quo. And a deficit model, which is what a lot of people, a lot of institutions, a lot of sectors are trying to do in terms of decolonization, preserving the way in which things have been done and then bringing more people in, doesn't disrupt institutional racism, does not disrupt systematic inequality. We keep on doing the same things because we keep on valuing the same things. The same inequalities will result. They may not result in the same places, but they would still result. And I think the question of what we value is key to the concept of decolonization. And that's why I think it's very important for us to think about the neoliberal university in terms of racial capitalism. And again, there's an entire lecture I can give on racial capitalism. I think I had a 3-hour lecture for my students on this point, and I'm going to try and say this in the next, I think, less than 10 minutes. But racial capitalism has been defined by so many people as a process or a systematic way in which socioeconomic value is derived from the racial identity of another. And there's a history to this. Think about the history of the world. And I think Jason Hickel in The Great Divide explains the history of inequality quite well in this sense. If it's a system by which the concept of value is then related to specific things that we socially construct as being important or lacking importance. I think it's important to understand racial capitalism, institutional racism, and the concept of racial in this way, that it's not just about creating inequalities, but it's also about creating hyper equalities or superiorities, and how the university and university epistemologies have been complicit in this. As Cedric Robinson suggests, racial violence constitutes a permanent rather than anterior condition of capital accumulation. And then think about that in terms of the neoliberal university, the increasing consumerization, financialization of the university. Cheryl Harris's Whiteness as Property, her thesis on this, I think is very important because she explains how identity has been used to grant and deny resources. Again, you have accumulation on the one hand, deprivation on the other, which is essentially, everything I've talked about is a question of tandem. We cannot talk about the role of universities in creating or bringing about racial justice without trying to disrupt how the university has played a role in racial injustice. Sorry, it's going back. So I think racial capitalism is important to the quest for racial justice in the neoliberal university, especially because of the increase in financialization and consumerization of the neoliberal university. In the words of Wendy Brown, the point is not just to rectify historical exclusions. Financialization induces universities to seek out those investments that boost its rankings in research and education. And that means giving priority to faculty, to students, to research areas, to programs that generate high rankings. And that means favoring the already privileged, the mainstream, the well-regarded by the highly regarded. And that's a disaster for decolonization of knowledge. And I completely agree with Wendy Brown on those particular points. If the university, or if universities seek to play a role in racial justice by engaging with decolonization as a vast and broad concept, then universities have to engage with their role in creating institutional racism, in maintaining institutional racism, and in how racial capitalism has created this particular world that we live in, and how the university is constantly producing knowledge for this particular world. So to go back to to summarize, institutional racism, social construction of race, and racial capitalism are embedded in the creation of our present world. And one of the roles of the university as it stands is to produce knowledge to continue to reproduce what we have. So to decolonize, and this is why I often suggest that it may be impossible to decolonize if we do not disrupt the way in which we continue to produce knowledge. As Achille Mbembe has suggested, in order to reproduce this itself, the principle of race depends on a particular assemblage of practices. And that is the direct target is the body of the other. There has to be an other and there has to be a self for this sort of reproduction to occur. And my the overarching message that I'm trying to give with this presentation is that in order to disrupt the reproduction of racial injustice, which the university structure, university sector is entangled with, decolonization has to involve reparational justice and structural change. Tokenism, in the sense in which EDI is often practiced, so sort of quota systems, for example, where the structure which excludes is not being confronted, all we do is then use sort of deficit models to say, well, because we know that the awarding gap is so wide, then we try and reduce it without actually addressing what is causing the awarding gap. And that's just one example. Or window dressing, which is quite a lot of what we've seen in the last few weeks. So quite a number of lecture halls changing their names, statues being renamed or contextualized. Those are very much, I would say, very basic and surface level approaches to decolonization. In other words, these approaches to decolonization are attempting to graft a vastly different logic, the decolonial logic of worlds otherwise, in the words of Arturo Escobar, trying to graft a logic of worlds otherwise, of thinking differently, of living differently, of being differently, onto a structure, that's the university structure, which is underpinned by the logic of racial capitalism, deriving value from racial inequality and racial injustice, that thrives on creating this sort of structure that thrives on creating and then exploiting inequality. To do decolonization properly, universities have to acknowledge where we have been as universities and where we can go. But most importantly, we have to change our minds about what we value as universities. Do we value rankings? Do we value consumerization? Do we value, for example, how much students earn when they graduate? So for example, we say degrees are value for money if within the first 4 or 5 years, a student can earn £40,000 in a year, then that degree is value for money. Again, it's a question of value. If there are anterior inequalities created by a social system or world system that has understood the concept of value to be something which is tied into a concept underpinned by racial inequality, then if we continue to create knowledges in that frame, then those the racial injustice that existed cannot really be disrupted. To think of worlds otherwise, we need to think of ourselves otherwise, and we need to think of value otherwise. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Luke, thank you very, very much for that very powerful analysis where you've brought together racism, decolonization, racial capitalism, and neoliberalism. And I think we very, very much needed that sort of analysis to bring together the real roots of exploitation and discrimination. And I want to really thank you for that. And you've also set us a challenge for us to look at our own history and see how we as universities have perpetuated and perhaps even created exploitation, oppression, and racism, and how do we overcome that. And you've also put forward some very interesting calls for action. So thank you very much. And I would now like to turn to our moderator, Jürgen Enders, to ask 2 questions from the chat room. Jürgen, over to you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the first question is from UWC, from Luvuyo Matsonda. The question is, I would like to ask Foluku, what impact does she think defacing, removal of colonial statues have on decolonization of universities in the world?
Okay, I think that's a many-layered question, because I think on the one hand, it speaks exactly, so defacing of statues speaks exactly to what I'm saying, because why are statues up? It's sometimes suggested that, you know, they're a reflection of history. But as I always say, if you want to learn history, you go and get a history degree. You don't look at a statue and then get a history degree. So it is, you know, if you've got a statue up that is a commemoration to someone who's done really horrible things, then that shows this is what we value. So there is, I would say, a space in this conversation for the defacing and the removal of statues, changing of names. But a lot of times then that becomes the only conversation, the full stop in the conversation. Once the statue, you know, say for example, you know, I live in Bristol, Colston took a swim in the river a few weeks ago, and then it becomes like, well, that's the end of it now. It took how many years to get Colston removed? So our energies are then devoted to something which is almost entirely symbolic. However, I do suggest that the symbolism is important as long as we don't center the statue removal as the end point of our conversations. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you very much. I move on to a question from Janine Sykes from Leeds. How can we change university structures when we are measured by values or metrics outside of our control?
Okay, so that's a very big question, and I'll try and do my best. So that's a really big question. I think I would say first and foremost, the question again is a question of value. What do we as academics value? If we value promotion, if we value salaries, and you know, to a certain extent, we do have to, because we have to pay mortgages and stuff like that. But if that's how we measure how valuable we are, rather than how decolonial we can be, then we fall into the same trap. So, and that's, you know, from a personal standpoint. But to think about it in a more structural way, and this is why I tend to use that word impossible. Is it possible for a university, an entire structure, to actually be restructured? And I think it goes back to a fundamental, almost existential question for higher education. What is education for? What are universities for? Who are universities for? And I think there's a schism, almost an identity crisis and especially in UK higher education. I think other countries as well will have that same, so other jurisdictions will have that same identity crisis. On the one hand, is education, higher education, a public good? On the other hand, is it a consumer good? It cannot be both. And universities are trying to be all things to all people, and that will not work. If universities are a public good, then there's more potential for restructuring. But as long as universities maintain the idea that they can be a consumer good, then cannot be restructured, because the whole point of consumerization is racial capitalism. Yeah, I think that would be my short answer.
Thank you very much, Jürgen. Thank you, Feluke. I would now like to introduce our second speaker, who is Professor Andre Keat. Andre is Research Chair for Critical Studies in Higher Education Transformation at Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. Andre is also Acting Deputy Vice Chancellor for Engagement and Transformation. He was visiting professor at the Carnegie School of Education at Leeds Beckett University, and was a visiting professor of human rights at the University of Connecticut. Andre is the chairperson of the Ministerial Oversight Committee on Higher Education Transformation in South Africa, and was also on the Commission for Gender Equality. His research links higher education transformation, social justice, human rights, democracy, and citizen education. Andre, it's a great privilege to have you with us. A warm welcome, and the screen is yours. So, Andre, over to you.
I'm struggling to hear.
Andre, yes, over to you.
I can't hear you.
Can you hear me, Andre? Andre, can you start your presentation?
Oh, you can hear me? Okay, if you can hear me, that's fine. But I have a problem in hearing the moderator. So hopefully we can sort out that technical challenge, okay? Right, and via the chat room. So thank you so much. Joshua Myers, reflecting on universities in the US, argues that the continued assaults on Black humanity is often articulated from academic spaces. Yet the same academy wants to question the normative valuations of whiteness. This intellectual genealogy of assault, he suggests, was often situated in universities. It thus becomes tricky and even arduous to consider the role of universities in racial justice, as it has been historically complicit in the production of racism. Yet there are options and possibilities to do differently. This talk will consider these options via the prism of racism's knowledge, a theme that I have worked on with talks at UCLA in the US and Justus Liebig University in Germany over the past 2 years. Thank you very much to Rajani and the International Center for Higher Education Management at the University of Bath, and of course, the Society for Research in Higher Education and our team at the research chair at Nelson Mandela University for putting this together. And to all of you for attending, much thanks for this. It is great. It was great listening to Foluke as well. So I'm honored to be in this space. But because of time, I will deliver my talk as a short paper. So my apologies for this if it sounds like a type of lecture space that I'm entering here, but that's all so that I can manage the 20 minutes that has been allotted to me. My input is crafted within the context of 3 global pandemics: racism, sexism and gender-based violence, and COVID-19. They remind us that we live in critical times, fragile times, at the edge of an abyss, at the limits of a future utopia that is fading away. Across the world, revolutionary moods and protests linked to social discontent has become part of the fabric of social life everywhere. The number of protests worldwide over the past 15 years are counted by the thousands per year, and in the US alone, some estimated the number at close to 11,000 for 2017 and 2018. Globally, the spike in protests relating to social discontent have become more large-scale, numerous, geographically widespread, and interesting scholarly work is emerging on this, including studies on South Africa, who is generally regarded as the protest capital of the world. Some, like CriSHET, have argued that the waves of protest during the present decade express a pervasive distrust in democratic institutions, a distrust in human rights and its agencies, and the dominance of the new right as a coalition comprising market liberals and political conservatives, which take hold over both our social reality and our political horizons in many parts of the world. This defect made possible the insanity of massive global inequalities and the conservatization of politics in Europe, North America, and elsewhere, tagged by tragically powerful new waves of intra and interstate racism, race populism, bigotry, everyday fascisms, and ethno-nationalisms across the world. A few days ago, the number of recent anti-racism protests in response to the killing of George Floyd and in support of the Black Lives Matter has been approximated at 3,600. So there's a global solidarity emerging in this space. But let us not forget that the massive upheavals that started in 2017 in the US were led by women and gender activists. And one of the reasons why 2019 was named the year of protest was because of global activisms that demanded an end to violence against women. Universities in South Africa were key sites of these interrelated protests. The C-19 pandemic does not simply produce racialized impacts, it has also propelled incidences of anti-Black and anti-Asian racism and xenophobia across the world. And it once again disclosed the systemic anchoring of racism in our society and our institutions. Universities have always been active production lines of racism, and this is not only linked to social practices and behaviors, but to knowledge and its organization. The very core, the very heart of the university its disciplines. More than any other social and intellectual arrangement, the disciplines permeate the life of the university. Academics and students are streamed, professional academic and student identities are constructed, scientific authorities are established and maintained, social statuses are affirmed, social spaces are mapped out, recognitions, rewards, and sanctions are distributed, and epistemic injustices are legitimated, all within the confines of the disciplinary organization of knowledge. I am working with Shirley and Tate, who was until recently a professor of race and education in the UK, on the theme of this talk. Now, I want to make a careful distinction here. Our argument is not simply that racism is inscribed into university knowledge systems and disciplines. This has been argued for many decades now, and also recently by Luis Leonardo. Rather, our point is that disciplined knowledge belongs to racism, and this proprietary relationship exercises steering power over how and about what we produce knowledge and the discourses by which such knowledge is disseminated. That is, the way in which knowledges are disciplined within universities suggests that racism provides the conceptual and pragmatic coordinates for knowledge. Let me share two progressive knowledge examples to argue this point. The first one relates to feminist scholarship. As you may know, Surma Bills put forward the argument on whitening intersectionality, the evanescence of race in intersexual scholarship, its vanishing, its disappearance. A point also raised by Black feminists in the UK and the African feminist movement in general. Bills refers to three whitening techniques observed in current intersectionality scholarship: genealogical and disciplinary whitening and the erasure of race through denial, reductionism, and dissociation. When Gibran and Salem argues alongside Bills that the use of intersectionality today does not necessarily produce critical research that is vastly distinguishable from previous liberal approaches to gender studies, they more or less argue that knowledge yields to racism. Roig, in another context, also argued that the reach of intersectionality in Germany has been such that many disciplinary fields, such as sociology, cultural study, history, law, philosophy, psychology, migration study, policy study, and of course, gender studies itself, have been touched by it. Numerous feminist scholars are currently working on intersectionality in German universities, and under this scholarship, she argues, intersectionality theory has undergone a process of depoliticization on its way to mainstream feminist movement in Germany. She further states that race is routinely erased from the discourse on intersectionality. A systemic and structural understanding of discrimination and inequality is missing. This is the case in many countries of the global north, and especially its academies. If intersectionality is whitened and depoliticized within a social justice-oriented field of study, such as feminist and gender studies, how much whiter than white then are our entire knowledge frames? To erase Black in Black scholarship has become all too easy, commonplace, and standard. And perhaps it is plausible that given this easy erasure, to suggest that knowledge always already belongs to racism within the act of disciplining it. The question of racism knowledge should not be confused with race science, scientific racism, or the racism of scientists. That has been studied for many, many decades now. And we have telling recent examples of these in the South African Academy and the global scholarship scene. Johnson and Walters, just last week, launched an edited collection on the roots of racial thinking in South African universities titled Fault Lines, a primer on race, science, and society. So the question of scientific racism is not the same question as that racism belongs that knowledge belongs to racism. They have logically two different sets of bases. And when it comes to scientific racism, this particular phenomenon that has been studied for decades now, the 1997 work of Emmanuel Eze on race and the Enlightenment stands proxy for me. It's arguments that I don't have to repeat because that has been done so well. Of course, the work of Achille Mbembe as well stands proxy in this case. But Eze demonstrated how philosophy has been instrumental in codifying and institutionalizing both the scientific and popular European perceptions of the human race. It is unneeded to repeat those arguments here. This reasoning is applicable across the disciplines, from the so-called hard sciences to the humanities and social sciences and beyond. Intellectual racism has always existed. Says Saini in a book published last year, reviewed by Alok Jha. It is a toxic little seed at the heart of academia. However dead you may think it is, it needs only a little water. And now it's raining, she says. It is easy to get the drift of Saini's argument, and you would know this book because it was published in the UK, but I would certainly not think of racism as a little seed. Rather, racism seems to have taken hold of our epistemic imaginations, gathering momentum over the past 2 decades. And this is what makes racism a proprietarius, an owner of property, etymologically derived from the medieval Latin in the mid-15th century that developed a variety of associated meanings in modern language. Holding property, pertaining to ownership, belonging or controlled as property, privately owned, and so on. The second example on my way to this argument refers to African studies, also set up to provide for social justice within the knowledge development network of the academic globe. I mobilize Zaleza's work when he argues that African studies since the 1950s and African universities have undergone many twists and turns, as both have expanded from their rather modest beginnings. Today, both are vast enterprises encompassing thousands of colleges and supporting institutions. However, over the past decades, the primacy of knowledge production in African studies shifted to the north, especially the United States, where by the 1970s, the field was firmly anchored in area studies. Zaleza goes further to provide a consummate account of the productive influences of post-colonial studies on African studies. However, he's equally scathing on post-colonial studies. He argues that the erasures of revolution, nation, class, history, and reality, even if they have started as critiques, turn the post into legitimating ideologies of contemporary global configuration of power and production. In similar vein, Gigandi argues that post-colonial theory has lost its focus on the structural as the interplay between politics, economics, and the social. Instead, an emphasis on culture protrudes from post-colonial theory. Thus, with Gigandi and Zaleza, and this is where they bring their arguments together, the post-colonial and post-structuralist intellectual developments have been limitedly useful in providing analytical schemes for engaging with the post-colony. So more importantly, he suggests that colonizing complicities are at the heart of these intellectual movements. They are therefore incapable of setting up a sustainable decolonizing academic political project. This critique of post-colonial studies requires serious consideration, which cannot be pursued here. The upshot of this gloomy assessment, according to Zaleza, is that the African response to, even in its militant Afrocentric forms, have largely consisted of investing Africa with the imagined positive attributes of Europe, rather than dismantling the very foundations of this colonizing epistemological order. So he asks, Can African studies escape, even transcend the Eurocentric coding, the seductions and sanctions of writing Africa by analogy? That is why Falola and Jennings ironically call to make African studies more African. Zaleza has shown that the example of African studies tasked to be African in the first place, but then choosing to be Western in the first place, is applicable across progressive knowledge formations in our university. And we as knowledge and critical knowledge scholars, we also fall into that particular same trap as well. In both these cases, racism provides the knowledge coordinates, disallowing progressive fields such as African and feminist studies to oppose the conventional disciplines within which Black conceptions of what it means to be human and Black ideals of life and Black ideals of justice remain unthinkable within the framework of our modern knowledges, to paraphrase Joshua Myers again. Despite our investment in the university as an institutional form steered by a neoliberal modern colonial imaginary, we need to generate critical hope. Not a naive hope, but the radical one, straining towards alternative possibilities, even if it means refusing the university. Since I entered the academy at the University of Fort Hare in 2008, I always had an interest in the political construction of the disciplines in South Africa as ways to disclose its entanglements with race and apartheid-driven subject formation that up till today inhibits university transformation. I had a deep systematic study of disciplinarity within this African context in mind to open up the possibilities for an African purpose curriculum. I am happy to say that some work on this is happening, though not nearly enough, and of course across different spaces in South Africa and in other parts of the world. Over the past few years, amidst the discourse around decolonizing the university, it seems that in the African context, we lack a critical conversation about Africanization and Africanity and what it means to know Africa, as Nzihoki and Okeja would have it. That is, we lack a thoughtful discussion on Africanization, decolonization, its interface and how it interplays within the university space. And perhaps through the Africanization debate, we may engage with decolonizing decolonization. A point put forward by Tsepo Matlingozi in a piece written in 2018 that marked the 10th anniversary of S.K. Mphahlele's death. I am of the view that we will generate better resources to work the radical transformation of universities in South Africa by engaging at the interface of Africanization and decolonization. The outlines of an African purpose curriculum will be shaped at that crossing point. Amongst the many transformation challenges around access, success, equity, and affordability, the expansion and shifting of the knowledge project in our universities will be a key turning point. And the fact that it hasn't happened is a contributing factor into the massive, massive project that you've seen unfolding in the world today. The transformation, decolonization, Africanization of our universities has been a national debate since 2008 after a ministerial committee probed the lack of change, and has been propelled into a much sharper spotlight by the 2015-2016 student protest in South Africa and elsewhere. Against this backdrop, our university established the research chair as a strategic outfit to drive the transformation of the university by grounding it in critical transformation studies and linking with other radical approaches to the study of universities, such as critical and abolitionist university studies. Given the hegemonic positions of the conventional disciplines, we view our work in critical terms, yet are acutely aware that the critical social theory on which so much of our praxis rests has historically also been blind to the question of race. So we have, in line with Rabaka and Africana critical theory with different regimes of truth and knowledges in mind, those that are most attuned to the lived experiences of Black people and the Black radicalism that emanates from such experiences. This is an almost impossible task, yet it remains perhaps the most productive option available to universities in its contribution to racial justice. An engagement with knowledges that works against the racial economy of the academy, knowledges that can disown racism, knowledge that are novel, that are new ones, as Maya would argue. After all, he says, emancipatory work requires new compositions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andre, for that really a talk that was really had so much depth and so much width in terms of your analysis. And I think especially important in the context of South Africa, where we have seen rising protests and very massive challenges. And one of the real challenges that has come out of the South African protest movement is to challenge the belief that democracy is only possible in the context of neoliberalism. So we've always been told that actually we need these dehumanizing, nasty markets to make us free. And I think a lot of the challenges that are coming out of the student movement in South Africa and worldwide is saying something very, very different. I think I also very much liked the way in which you showed how we are seeing on globally both the rise of global solidarity movements against exploitation, but at the same time we are seeing rising xenophobia, including inter-ethnic conflict all over the world. The role of disciplines, for example, philosophy, is absolutely fascinating and something that we should really be tackling. And of course, both the possibilities as well as the challenges of intersectionality. Why is it sometimes so conflictual? How do we link gender and ethnicity? How do we move forward? So I want to thank you very, very much for a very inspirational talk. And I turn to Jürgen now for the two questions for Andre.
Hello again. First and importantly, Andre, can you hear me? Hello?
Jürgen, if you, I'm on another computer under Annelien Keat. So if you, my mic gave problems, so I had to switch computers quickly at home.
Okay, but
so I can hear you now.
Yes. Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you. So we have quite a lively discussion in this chat room about where do we find inspiring practices in universities. And among one voice in this discussion asked to know a bit more about what your university is doing in terms of curriculum, in terms of staff development, maybe in other terms as well, to change its practices, to contribute to the important tasks that you have laid out for us. Could you say a bit more about your own university, please?
Thanks, Jürgen. Oh, I didn't want to be so self-consuming into our own space, but I can certainly share with you. Our university has over the past 10 to 12 years, of course, struggled to generate itself into a new modern entity that's also social justice oriented in different kinds of ways. So over the past decade, of course, a number of programs has come into being that engages with both the question of curriculum development, staff development, emerging Black academics, different sets of transformative processes. But as you would know, these are never enough. And under the new era now, since Prof. Mutua has taken over, of course, we are trying to re-energize and invest this particular project with a new energy. And so the question around curriculum and the transformation of the university, which I regard actually as one of the key areas of entry, is something that will not fall out of the sky, but there are certainly many processes in place within the university, within the various disciplines as well. And especially actually around the question of African feminist imaginations, where there are real decolonizing work at play, excavating African intellectual traditions, and of course deploying some of the African historical concepts into the study of sociology and other fields as well. So there are certainly a number of programs and projects that people can access via our website that speaks to the broader transformation project of the university, but also its attempts at shifting the knowledge project and the intellectual culture of the university.
Thank you very much, Andre. The second question, it's kind of related, but it moves more on to disciplinary issues. As higher education is pushed for STEM, for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and pushed for disinvestment into humanities, should African higher education push for African studies with humanities and social sciences at its core?
Thanks, Jürgen. In fact, that question reminds me of one of our key strategic priorities, and that is the revitalization of the humanities, with the understanding that a revitalized humanities capable of reading social reality from the experiences of the majority of our people in the country and providing productive interpretive schemes for engaging with it, that particular project will be a game changer in both the knowledge project and of course the broader transformation of the university. Actually, there are some work being done between the linkages of strong humanities and social sciences and the transformative capacity of institutions. So it will be, I think it will be very unfortunate if we don't focus on the humanities and the social sciences as we deal with the project of decolonization and Africanization, not as an either or, but to give equal attention to the variety of knowledge frames that is required within the development matrix of any continent or development matrix of any country as well. So I would certainly say that in our own space, of course, that is a strategic area of thought and of praxis. The question around African studies, as you would know, there are massive mapping exercises as to what has been achieved by the growth in African studies, and the analysis is not favorable. So one has to think about what kind of African studies one would like to have within the university space, and what kind of African studies can develop a kind of knowledge inclusivity that affirms the right to be African within the space of a global community that is always oriented in ways that tries to suppress that kind of affirmation as well. So one will have to be careful about how you set up a new African studies program against the backdrop of the critiques that have emanated from the analysis of what African studies have achieved over the past decades.
Thank you very much, Andre. And back to Rajni.
Okay, thank you very much, Andre. What I would like to do now is to ask people to please post questions in the chat room for both speakers, for Fuluke and for Andre. So Fuluke, if you can also please come back on screen. And Jürgen will once again moderate those questions and read those questions out. Jürgen, over to you.
Thank you. Give me a moment, because there's so much coming in that once I want to read something, it disappears from my chat screen.
So while Jürgen is looking, maybe
I'm
while...
back.
Oh,
I'm back.
okay.
One moment, please. So, I mean, this is an important and peculiar question, I know. I would like to pose it to both of our speakers. It's around the role of funding. And to what extent universities could change their funding models to become more inclusive and taking into consideration poor students?
Fuluke, shall I go first? Okay, thanks. Yeah, I saw that in the chat room as well. Of course, you see, there is a side of this argument that suggests that university education should be free for poor students, and that is certainly something that I can agree with. And so the broader battle is within the debate around both Africanization, transformation, and decolonization, is to have a particular movement that challenges the funding models of universities in relation to percentages of GDPs, so that those percentages can be increased and provide for access for poor students on the basis that they have access to education which is totally free. I would suggest, especially for poor students.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Fuluke, would you like to come in?
Okay, I think it's a heavy question,
right?
Because in a way, we there's a tendency that we get trapped in a cycle where we argue about funding, and then we get funding, and then we use it to do things which are do not have education or knowledge democracies at its end. So that's why I say it's a heavy question, but it's also a necessary question, because without funding, we can't get anything done. I agree with Professor Andre. I completely believe that education should be free, especially for students who cannot afford it. Because if it's not free for students who are unable to afford education, then again you have this reproduction of a history where the already privileged have access to more privilege. But I also think universities need to think about what they fund and why they fund. And again, talking very much from a UK perspective, how much time we spend writing grants, the things we need to show when we're writing research grants are not always things that universities should be valuing, I would suggest. And I think we should sort of return to the basis of why universities exist on the question of funding. Because if not, universities, I would say to a certain extent, universities do make quite a lot of money, but what do they spend that money on? And how much does government give to universities? So there are two competing ends here. How much universities already have and what they should spend in them on, and how much more government should be given to universities, and I would say educational institutions as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And if it's okay, I continue with another question for you, Fuluke, from Lucia from SOAS in London. I wonder if you could add to the conversation the responsibility of care when it comes to decolonizing. Where do we center Black students in this conversation? How can universities invest in targeted support for Black students?
Okay, so that's another interesting question, especially I would say in the context of what's happening currently in the sort of very rapid conversations happening around decolonization and anti-racism in university higher education. I think one of the problems we find here is that universities, understandably, and not forgivably, but understandably, are reluctant to make change. So there is almost a failure to center Black students, or to actually, you know, as the question says, the care for Black students. And I think if you approach decolonization as so centering the concept of anti-Blackness, and especially in terms of an intersectional frame. Sorry, I'm being interrupted again. Especially in terms of an intersectional frame. Okay, darling. So especially in terms of an intersectional frame. If you think about the hierarchies that already exist, and the concept of anti-Blackness in relation or in response to those hierarchies. My understanding and my belief, and this is definitely the position of Black studies, is if you want to restructure an institution or a sector or a society or a world, and you restructure it for the benefit of those placed at the very bottom, you center them, you know, at the very bottom, then it's more likely that it is restructured for those who are placed in the middle of that hierarchy. I hope that makes some sort of sense, because I'm slightly distracted. So if you think about, you know, anti-Blackness as a concept, the way in which Black people within any structure, and especially Black women or Black LGBT community, are placed at the bottom of the structure. If you re-envision the structure for the benefit of those who are placed at the bottom, then those who are placed in the middle or near the bottom also benefit. So I think universities should concentrate on centering Black students' needs, and that's not exactly what is happening across the board. It's sort of trying to move slowly to the bottom rather than sort of rapid or fundamental restructuring.
Thank you very much. I move on to a question that I think is for André. Your inspiring lecture has set me wondering what might be meant in this context by Africa and by African.
Now, who would be so wicked to ask a question like that?
You can look that up in the chat later.
Or for choosing one like that. Yeah, no, thanks. I think it's from Ronald. Yeah, hello, Ronald.
Right.
Lovely to have you in the lecture, or in the webinar. You see, there are so many ways in which this question can be answered. You can have a culture, geography, allyship, commitment, you know, all those kinds of birth, connection. You can have all those different sets of connotations attached to it. But I am actually aligned to a very, very straightforward assertion from Ramos, one of our top philosophers here in our country, and that is that African means the right to assert oneself as an African.
Mm.
And that is more or less, it's very, very powerful. It sounds fairly straightforward, but there's a huge complexity that comes with that particular understanding. And so, of course, and that has implications for what is then meant by Africanization, and different sets of ways in which we then engage with this particular notion, or what it is to know Africa as well. But the work of Ramos is very instructional in engaging with such a such a straightforward yet complex question that you're asking.
Thank you very much. I have here a question for both speakers, and I suggest that we start with Fuluki. From Nelson Mandela University, Glenn. What do you say to those who are afraid to lose their jobs because they speak truth to power and do real meaningful transformation work?
Okay, again, that's a heavy question because I think it's in some cases it's a very real fear that people will lose their jobs. And this is why we need people who are more established to speak. Because what often happens is people at the very bottom of the university structure tend to be the ones, because there is almost a combination of oppressions or vulnerabilities to the structure happening at the very bottom, and the higher you go, the less so. So I would say the higher you go, the louder you should speak. But I think there's also the problem that the fear you get used to at the bottom, because there's a real danger, a concrete, actual material danger that you may lose your job or not get any job if you are seen as a troublemaker. There's a real sort of potential that the silence that you get used to at the bottom of the structure becomes part of your way of operating as you climb up the structure. So I do understand, and I don't think that we should not be strategic, but this is also why we should build connections and networks beyond the university. Because sometimes we may not be able to speak within the university, but we are able to speak outside the university. If you're at the very bottom, then there's a limit to what we can do, but you can all, that doesn't mean you should do nothing. But I think our voices should get louder as we climb higher. And what we often see in practice anecdotally is that voices actually get quieter as we do climb higher.
Thank you. Andre, would you like to join?
Yes, thanks, Jürgen. Hello, Glenn. I fully agree with Fuluke's response, and that is, one requires different sets of solidarities and networks to do difficult work within institutional spaces that by its design generate different sets of hierarchies that tries to reproduce itself all the time, silently overnight, as they would say. But I suggest that if you tie this into the idea that because of the way in which knowledge is disciplined within the university and how authority and credentialization and status comes with that particular kind of project, doesn't matter whether you are white or black, it seems to usurp the academic character into a particular frame that disallows different sets of critiques for which the university should be open in any case. And this is one of the other ironies of the university. The university should be on the side of truth, but once it is spoken to power, it creates its own defense mechanisms. So there is something about the psychology of the academic character and the academic personality that requires various forms of studies, and the way in which we more or less internalize forms of being within the university that goes against the total idea of working the knowledge project. There's a whole disjuncture between the types of personalities and characters and behaviors that get generated within the university and the humility that must come with working in a knowledge project. It's one of the strange things that I can't get my head around. And that is, when you work with knowledge, it requires a certain kind of humility, and it actually generates humility in various senses, or it should at least do that. But there is something about the academy that that becomes a kind of constraint in speaking truth to power, generated from within itself.
Thank you. A question that kind of very nicely joins the previous one from Eva in Cambridge. What allies outside of universities could critical forces within universities build on to transform our institutions? Maybe Fuluki, would you like to respond?
Okay. I mean, I think the question is context dependent as well, because it depends on what, and I'm a little bit, I don't like to be sort of weighed down by semantics, but I'm a little bit worried about the word allies as well, because if we have a joint problem, then I don't think there are people who are allied to the problem. But I would say, people who are not within the university who we can work together. So I think Rajani mentioned this at the beginning when she was introducing me. Set up a thing called FACE, which is Forever Africa Conference and Events. And one of the things that we have tried to do is to speak beyond and from beyond the university, and also speak beyond the university. And to do that, we've worked with people.
I know why that guy's monster is not. It's
Sorry.
Orphanage.
Okay, you need
So
to.
much orphanage.
Shush. Sorry. So we've worked with people like primary school teachers, secondary school teachers, journalists, people who are involved in sort of NGOs. So I think the question is always, what are we trying to achieve?
Mommy, did I leave the bathroom lights on?
No, you didn't, darling.
Okay.
Sorry. The question is always, what are we trying to achieve? And not just what the university is trying to achieve, but what are we trying to achieve and who can help us achieve it? And that's why I say the question is sort of context dependent, because not only is it geographical, but it's also purposive in the sense that you have an aim or a goal, you have a micro aim, and you also have a macro aim. And you're also based in a particular location, and sort of taking all of that together, who can you work with? And I think one of the problems we have, and I find that personally, is that in higher education, we're so overworked that it becomes very, very difficult to build solidarities and build these networks, because we're constantly, for the purposes of progression as well, career progression, we're constantly having to meet with people who are within the same sort of university sector, and in most cases within the same department. So there is a need to almost deliberately look for networks that you can work with. But what I have found personally is that once you begin to look for people to work with, then it snowballs quite quickly.
Thank you. Andre, would you like to join?
Thanks, Jürgen, and thanks, Uke, for that. Yeah, it's quite. I suspect that the exploration of alliances outside of the university for its own reconstitution or transformation project is probably a prerequisite for the university to change. I don't think that the university would be able to have a productive change trajectory without the progressive forces that are outside of the university spaces, civil society, organizations, people's coalition, different sets of role players in that space. And of course, if one have to argue that the university's opening up of itself to different kinds of voices to be able to be a responsive university in any case, which should be one of the objectives of a decolonial or a transformed university, then certainly role players outside of the university spaces would require equalizing you know, a point of coming together with the university architecture to play a very, very substantive role in supporting and of course even directing the university's change project.
Thank you very much, and thanks to both of you for responding to a number of very substantial and difficult questions. Many thanks for the participants for not only raising all these questions, but also having a very lively exchange on the chat at the same time. And I think it is now time to hand over to Rajani again.
Thank you, Jürgen, and I would like to thank everyone, all the participants, for really participating so thoughtfully, so insightfully, so energetically, and also in such a challenging way to all of these issues that were raised today. And I think what we saw was a huge amount of creative responses, but also what came out were the fault lines, the real tensions that we may be able to overcome and bridge, or they may be real tensions that we may have to actually acknowledge and think about other ways in which to respond. I'm very, very sorry that we were not able to answer all the questions. There just wasn't enough time, but what I will do is I will send the transcript to both our speakers in case they wish to comment further on any of the questions. And I know that Francois will send the recording as well as the transcript to all the participants here. Many people have said that they would like to continue the conversations. So I think Francois and I can talk about, and Lisa can talk about how we continue to continue the conversations. So I want to end by saying a really, really, really big thank you from my heart and my head and my politicalness and everything to our two speakers who were amazing, brilliant synergies as well as differences. And I call upon everyone now to please turn on your microphone and your videos and give them a big applause.
And thank you, Rajani, for your chairing and your perspective. And to everybody, I will shortly after this send out the link and for Lottie's PowerPoint to all of you, and the evaluation form, please, which I hope you would fill in. So in the meanwhile, enjoy your afternoons. If I can ask you all to sign out of the event, except for the speakers, please, Rajani and Jürgen, that would be great. So thank you. Thank you one and all.
Francois, do you need me to stay on?
Just briefly, please, if you don't mind. Have you got something else to go on to?
No, I'm fine. Fine. Yeah, thanks, Feluke. It was lovely listening to you. And thanks, Rajani.
Thank you very much, Professor Andre. It was nice to e-meet you.
And it's Andre, eh?